morning slash evening slash afternoon slash night class. Welcome to another day of self-educating. Before we begin, picture this. You are sitting in the dim light of your school's bathroom stall, staring at a single spot. A single lone textured spot of dry moist crimson on your white underwear, and you're wondering what led up to this. What led up to this moment? Your mind backtracks to your spotless, bodiless childhood, back to your birth when the doctor assigned you, further back to when your uterus was being formed and created within someone else's uterus, back in time to your erstwhile ancestors who lived with both uteruses and a village that disliked uteruses. And it all makes you wonder, what does it mean to bleed? A short rundown version of our historic understanding of menstruation goes like this. What the heck? Alright, Second millennium BC folks, aka the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks, believed that the uterus roamed around menstruators' bodies because why freaking not, I guess. This uterine wanderlust used to be connected to feminine hysteria and various other illnesses, even up until the 18th century AD, because I suppose it was common practice to only allow cis men to become doctors and academics back in the day, and we all know that they can be exceptionally stupid sometimes. So thankfully the FYI, the whole uterus moving around the body thing is false, completely false and bizarre. Anyways, fast forward, science progressed, blah blah blah. What was once paperless and cloth became cloth and more cloth, and eventually at some point folks started to become concerned about the bacterial growth resulting from improper cleaning of reusable cloth, and we came upon Kotex, which came after World War I, when nurses discovered that cellulose bandages were actually super absorbent. And yep, the World Wars also led to a reform in the gender work gap, which meant that there was an increased need for increased comfort so that folks and menstruators of even more socio-economic classes could work and do jolly good industrial labor. Not like they already had any working, but industrial labor is actual work or something. I don't know. Anyways, yeah, basically the whole point was never about comfort, it was just about capitalism. During the same period, there was another really cool invention that did not get the same fame as Kotex, by an African American inventor, Mary Kenner, who invented the sanitary pad, which would have been super, I'm guessing, much more comfortable, because just in general all her inventions was centered around improving comfort and accessibility to resolving needs that were generally and structurally excluded or ignored. And I think just her legacy is something that we should all be inspired by, especially inventors, people in the science field, which is really cool. Just really cool. Read up about her. All the links for everything that I'm discussing here today will be in the thing. Right, moving on. In fact, here in India too, most folks before plastic pads and disposable pads became more common would use a similar almost DIY sanitary belt, if you will, where they would use a nala or a thread and then mount cloth on top of that thread, which would the thread would go around the waist. And if folks still use that even in urban regions, mostly in rural regions, though it's not as comfortable. And I mean, this particular one that people use here, the DIY one that people make from their own scraps of cloth, are obviously not comfortable and can lead to improper cleaning, etc. But more on reusable cloth and its benefits and everything later. And now, speaking of the urban-rural dynamic, let's move on to considering major events in history. Let's take up the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, which harshly impacted menstruators who were particularly from low-income urban backgrounds because their particular sexual and reproductive health needs are the first to get deprioritized in a crisis. And the implications of inaccessibility to clean, safe water, along with the inaccessibility to menstrual hygiene products, coupled with the issue of menstrual waste from disposable pads, poses a conundrum that showcases the relationship between WASH, that's water and sanitary hygiene, pollution, and socioeconomic barriers. And the reason why these needs are deprioritized is because they are already stigmatized, which causes people and people in positions of power to ignore them when there's a healthcare crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic. Elaborating on this, here's a brilliant perspective from Jahan N's research paper. Water is often viewed as a technical field, usually dominated by cis men, who tend to offer technical solutions to water-related problems. Adopting a rights-based approach for access to water and sanitation could provide women, girls, and people with marginalized genders the opportunity to exercise their agency, redress power relations, and improve equitable access to water for sexual and reproductive health. A rights-based approach will challenge the structural discrimination that people of marginalized genders face, not only within the health system, but also in their public and private lives. The social and cultural factors pushing them to exclusion and discrimination need to be considered when attempting to fulfill their rights to safe water and sanitation. Speaking of pollution caused by disposable pads, this leads to the problem of dealing with the socio-ecological impacts of waste. Pad incinerators simply use up electricity and cause toxic fumes to emit, which kind of defeats the whole purpose, and it's just not great when dealing with biomedical waste. Another question which is also posed is, who will ultimately manage that waste? This question and its connections to caste will be discussed in a while. Around 12.3 billion sanitary napkins, amounting to 113,000 tons of waste, reached India's landfills every year, according to a new study. Improper disposal and non-segregation from household waste leads to unhygienic working conditions for waste workers, the report said. Fortunately, as we learn about the urgency of the climate crisis, environmentalists are beginning to favor low-waste alternatives to products of daily consumption and to disposable products in the first place, rather than segregating them later. It's better to avoid using them, but it's better to reduce waste rather than do stuff with waste later. It just defeats the whole purpose. We're all just trying to find our purpose here. Anyways, naturally, producers and consumers in the economy are returning back to reusable products, given that we are living in another crisis. Cloth pads and menstrual cups and period undies are now fashionable and sustainably chic, which is mostly a good thing in my opinion. As long as small businesses and NGOs which are owned by actual menstruators, actually ethically producing these products, and it doesn't get monopolized by the capitalists, or worse, their kids, the fast fashion corporates all over again. If that doesn't happen, then this is great. This movement for sustainable menstruation works brilliantly. If you're living in Mumbai, I would highly recommend checking out the NGO Asha Sakhi, where women from low-income and structurally excluded backgrounds are provided with vocational training and employment to produce sustainable and reusable cloth products, including pads. While reusable products may not necessarily be accessible to all, especially menstruators who are from low-income urban backgrounds, because of that particular location, particular positions, lack of infrastructure and accessible clean water and sanitary hygiene to actually clean the cloth pads properly when you use them, because cloth pads need to be properly cleaned in order for them to actually be hygienic and healthy to use. And if there's no water, then you can't clean pads. You can't clean cloth pads. You can't clean reusable pads. And in that case scenario, they have to use disposable products for at least meeting that basic hygiene. Yet, there is still hope for reusable products, because in the long run, this could actually be a viable solution to both the waste management and period poverty issues. Because, given that you're using, 300 rupees cloth pads, which should last you for 3 years, so you're just spending 300 rupees for 3 years of all your menstrual needs, as opposed to approximately 600 disposable plastic pads costing around 8 rupees each, would be 4,800, right? 4,800 rupees spent over the course of 3 years, which is obviously the reusable cloth pads option is a lot better, both from a financial perspective and from the environment, because imagine causing 600 freaking cloth pads to accumulate. 600 plastic pads to accumulate. What am I saying? Imagine causing 600 plastic pads to accumulate. That's a heck lot of plastic. Anyways, and just overall, sustainable menstrual products are typically a lot more comfortable and hygienic, with lower risks of infection and rashes. If you do not believe me, search it up. To summarize the role of the menstrual industry, that word shouldn't exist, but it does. To summarize the role of the menstrual industry in the economy, I shall quote this amazing book titled Cash Flow, The Business of Menstruation by Dr. Camila Rostvik, that I found for free on just JSTOR, and that I absolutely love and I'm currently reading, and have been reading for a long time because it's been on my TBR and my TBR isn't this long. But I have been reading it and it's so good. It's just so interesting. Anyways. As a group of private enterprises, the menstrual economy fits into a larger world of personal care capitalism. For example, contraceptives, diapers, formula milk, bras and makeup share many of the same hyper-gendered power hierarchies. Similar to menstruation, these items have also transgressed the boundaries of private enterprise and entered the arena of quote-unquote, I added the quote-unquote, not quoting that, but like activism or state intervention in recent decades. In this way, the menstrual economy and other parts of personal care capitalism function differently from sectors which simply lobby governments to gain more influence. Instead, their elevation into conversations about social justice means that these entities operate beyond the private sphere, and also engage with public and political arenas. While menstrual product manufacturing is a story populated by working class women, leadership was male. Many of these chapters document the hyper-gendered nature. Many of these chapters are the chapters from the book, which is long. Many of these chapters document the hyper-gendered nature of the industry, whereby women dominate the factory floor and men occupy the boardroom. By no means unique to this industry, the case of menstrual product manufacturing illustrates facets of wider heteronormativity in the 20th century. On one hand, female workers were given the opportunity to work because male leaders thought it would be more appropriate for them to make feminine products. On the other hand, the gender binary was held tightly in place in terms of actual influence over products, technological development, or working practices. Here we basically see the reliance of the individual menstruator on an arbitrary and binary system, whereby a basic biological need is commercialized, turned into a marketable process rather than a biological or even a social one. The worker's dignity, even the worker's dignity, is not factored into the socially positive image of the corporate. After all, a worker is simply hired to produce these products, to sell them, and then to figure out how to dispose off of them, without a say in how all these processes are actually done. Even in the sphere of labor within any industry for that matter, not just the menstrual industry, are these workers actually able to protect their own menstrual rights and menstrual health? I will be discussing workers' rights from a menstruator's perspective in a bit, but the deal is that the menstrual industry's role in the menstrual experience then becomes one of relevance to its social impacts, which is evident from the CSR pages of all of these brands' websites. Many such social impact actions, and when I say this, I'm particularly talking about big corporates, not the smaller businesses and NGOs that are actually doing impactful work. Many of the big corporates, when they claim to be doing something positive for things, be skeptical. Many such social impact actions are temporary resolutions to a perpetual issue, making menstruators constantly reliant on the production of pads by those brands, by those very same brands that are trying to do good stuff, I guess. Investing in the disposable pad supply of low-income communities in the name of CSR can perpetuate a white or Brahminical savior complex, because communities are then made reliant on these free distributed products without really being included in menstrual discourse, being provided necessary SRHR education, and or enabling self-reliance by sharing knowledge on safe reusable products. Because actually spreading SRHR education and being inclusive and making stuff accessible would simply be too radical for corporates, I suppose. In an era when discussions about colonialism, Black Lives Matter and racism have been covered extensively in the media from all the traditional corporations' nations, it stands to reason that a reckoning with the industry's own role in colonial history and imperialism will come soon. From its role in indigenous history in North America and Scandinavia, to the centering of white traders and women, to the whiteness paradigm of product advertising, to the patronizing messages about girls in the global south, and the industry's role in environmental pollution. All of these factors mean that, increasingly, marketing has to do a lot of heavy lifting to balance corporate histories. But consumers do not always accept apologies, excuses, or diversions. Startups are providing alternatives to companies with troubled pasts, while the option of free bleeding removes the individual from the industry entirely. Bleeding is a concept shot to fame when Kiran Gandhi, an American musician, ran the London Marathon while menstruating without any feeded products on. This prompted conversations on whether it is truly possible to bleed without having to consume at all. That is, without having to bear the costs of being a menstruator and consumer of menstrual products within the economy at all. Although these form a niche, there are a couple of reasons for which quoting the same book,
people might opt out of menstrual consumerism. This could be because they may not always have access to, or simply may not wish to use menstrual products due to factors such as poverty, gender dysphoria, stigma, embarrassment or shame attached to those products, disability and or chronic pain. The very idea of free bleeding may sound strange because of course there are practical problems such as having to wash the stains out, but also because it is deeply radical. Ending this class with another beautiful quote. And for those experimenting with the boundaries of their own internalized menstrual shame, trying out free bleeding, if only just once, may challenge an individual's perceptions. Class, you may have noticed a recurrent thread throughout our discussion as of yet: stigma. It is inevitable that a biological phenomenon should develop a social construct surrounding it, and hence we have blood that is tinted blue. Puberty and everything related to it is fraught with stigma for God knows what reason, making shame as a rite of passage for all young people. There is even more to it though. Given that we live in a society, stigma is not isolated to merely a disgust for blood that comes from down there. It's not merely about menstruation. In South Asia especially, this disgust for menstruation is fueled more so by casteist notions of purity and impurity. This intersection of caste with both the socio-economic and accessibility aspect of menstruation as well as stigma, coupled with the permeable nature of caste in marginalization and South Asian societies and diasporas, ought to be highlighted more in menstrual discourse. One instance of non-inclusivity in menstrual discourse pertains to discussions on menstrual leaves, which is critical for many menstruators, especially those who also have chronic illnesses and disabilities. They particularly need space and time to deal with menstruation because it can be incredibly tiring, or incredibly exhausting, or incredibly expensive. And menstrual leaves and the idea of being able to take a break from work is critical for many menstruators. However, there's a marked ignorance of menstruators who do not have the caste and socio-economic privilege to take a break. An article for Feminism in India about the implications of menstrual discourse for Dalit and Adivasi communities by Shraddha T.K. Lama point blank asks oppressor caste or Savarna people whether you yourself would grant a domestic worker hired by you period leaves while paying them their wages fairly. It's critical we understand how these power dynamics, aka hegemonies, come into play even in our own perceptions of these issues, and who we see as menstruators and who we don't, even though menstruation is a biological process. Our social understanding of it is shaped from a very elitist perspective at times. In an ideal society, people who have chosen to work as domestic workers, caregivers, or in positions that are considered to be wage-based or informal in economic terms should have the basic privilege of earning the same salary and rights as anyone else. But we don't live in an ideal society, and people are structurally excluded from the idea of choice that is central to modern feminism on the basis of, so people are excluded from this idea of choice, which is supposed to be the main goal for the modern wave of feminism almost. But people are excluded from this choice on the basis of caste, disability, gender identity, and various other identity factors and intersectionalities. Hence, most people do not have the choice to choose their positionality, which impacts their education, profession, responsibilities, bodies, how they menstruate, the products they use, and their life as a whole. Even in formal salary jobs, Dalit menstruators who face both marginalization due to their gender and caste face discrimination. In 2015, a renowned advocate, Kiruba Munuswamy, who now leads the Life for Rights, a legal initiative for equality that also maps caste-based atrocities in India, was removed from her job as a Supreme Court lawyer for taking a period leave due to severe migraines and cramps. In her Twitter thread about her experience, she also brought to light how menstruators from Dalit and MBC backgrounds are illegally forced to take pills to keep them slogging through their menstrual cycles. This idea of separating rights for different jobs that are societally deemed worthy of rights is in itself in the first place elitist. Work out to be work regardless, and having equitable pay for all is critical to breaking down socioeconomic barriers in my opinion. But first, in South Asia, given that socioeconomic issues and barriers are deeply connected to caste, this would require annihilation of caste as a Hindutva ideology in the first place. And an annihilation of caste would pave way for socioeconomic freedom, for the idea of socialism, for having equity of all people. And to understand how menstruation fits into this caste and socioeconomic positionality, I would also recommend reading the entirety of Deepthi Sukumar's personal narrative, Caste is My Period, which is a research paper, essay, published on a research platform, on a research site, which is again linked below. From the conclusion of which, I will be quoting a small fragment. The discourse is silent on the problem of ritual purity being the patriarchal mechanism to maintain social inequality and the caste system. It ignores that the Dalit woman and her particular and complex problems, untouchability, caste discrimination and oppression, are different from that of a menstruating upper caste woman, yet linked to the same patriarchal and casteist scheme. The recent protests, which is in reference to, I think, the temple protests, which have raised menstruation to an unprecedented level on the gender debate, should have become the entry point for addressing the role of caste and patriarchy in the complex oppression faced by Dalit women. The subject of menstrual taboos is the right context to understand gender inequality and oppression within the framework of intersectionality. She brings to light of how for a sanitary worker whose dignity is stripped away by casteism and Savarna brutality, in that they are not provided with basic safety equipment and facilities and are often forced into the job. Handling a wrongly disposed sanitary product can give way to life-threatening concerns. And in general, how her experiences were shaped by her identity as a menstruator and a Dalit is important when tackling any issue pertaining to menstruation, because caste permeates stigma, poverty and inequity and practically everything, as I earlier stated. All the resources that I have used are always linked down in the description for further reading and self-education, which is necessary for Savarnas and people in positions of privilege to do. Speaking of education as a place beyond the boundaries of its system, media's role in that system is quite prominent. the period education that you'll get in other schools obviously sucks. Which is why you have yours truly making 40-minute long wannabe educational videos. Ha. But seriously, none of us grew up learning about the intersections, complexities, and even the basic health information about why we're menstruating and what that freaking means. And for many of us, our family members, usually this is female ones, the internet and what little we learned from our textbooks formed our basic knowledge of periods. But for folks who don't even have access to this video or to the internet at large, that knowledge automatically becomes a lot more limited. There is also the issue of people not being able to continue their education because of periods, and their education essentially ceasing because of the lack of wash facilities at their school and lack of that basic infrastructure that allows them to continue their education while being on their periods. It's a vicious cycle where the most oppressed people and students and menstruators cannot go to school, cannot receive education because of that, and that eventually leads them to be more oppressed because they don't have the basic SRHR education that they need. This lack of intersectional menstrual education, and often enough lack of menstrual education at all, prompts menstruators and non-menstruators alike to seek education from media. And quoting Menstruation, an Ableist Narrative by Priyanka Nair, the stories that we tell or don't tell about bodies matter. She analyzes popular advertising and media, noting the lack of people with disabilities menstruating within these spaces. Exclusion in media hinders public awareness and mass education, affecting how people and the public at large perceive menstruation, menstrual issues, and menstruation as a spectral experience by so many different people, by disabled people, by people from different castes, different genders. It's a lot more expansive than what we think, and that's where our media falters. So here, when we're talking about from the disability perspective, menstruation's relationship with sex is a lot more profound, given that ableism often undermines disabled desires and choices. While menstruators with disabilities aren't involved in the decision-making process of what they need, what they want to do for their own bodies, for their own menstruating bodies, that can lead to medical professionals and caregivers deciding, generally parents and guardians, deciding what's best for the menstruator, for the disabled menstruator or menstruator with disabilities, without your actual consent, which can result in non-consensual menstrual cessation. And Priyanka Nair goes in depth into the legalities and ethics of such decisions, as well as explains how the medicalization of menstruation in this context particularly affects people with disabilities, when in fact for many of us menstruation is considered to be a natural process. That's how we comfort ourselves when we are menstruating. But for people with disabilities, it becomes a very nuanced medical issue, because it could be interconnected with so many different things, and that's how medical professionals see it, which kind of hinders the relationship that disabled people have with their body, with their menstruation as a natural process. She also elaborates on how period shame can manifest differently for disabled folk, where social etiquettes may make menstrual care more inaccessible for people with disabilities and their caretakers. Now, where does this come into media? Because media, especially menstrual media, is known to perpetuate a certain idea of autonomy, independence, and productivity, feeding into the capitalist idea that menstruation and that menstruators gotta get to work, that we need to constantly put our bodies, and menstruators constantly need to put their bodies through work, through slogging away in order to earn, to be able to afford the very same super comfortable products, so they from super ethical brands, so that they can continue to do their work superbly, because that's just how the system is built, and that's how media works, I guess. Basically, our current work culture was not a work culture, systems was not actually built for menstruating bodies, as Kristen Leo elaborates in their video really well. Their video on goblins, which I would highly recommend if you're PMSing and or annoyed or sick. It just helps. That video is just one of the most helpful videos on YouTube. Anyways, you're right. In that video, Kristen Leo argues how work timings have been built around general cis male bodies rather than bodies with a longer and more extreme duration of hormonal fluctuations, and these systems are even more inaccessible for disabled menstruating bodies. The blogger Crippled Scholar also notes the lack of discourse about disabled menstruation and how this conversation is most often appropriated by folks without disabilities such as myself. She also elaborates on how alternative sustainable menstrual products can sometimes be more comfortable for disabled menstruating folk. But I mean, by alternate, I mean products like tampons, products like menstrual cups, period undies, all the different things, right? Though it is also noted that this is not always the case, and period discourse in disability movements cannot be generalized, because not all menstruators are homogeneous, not all period products work for everyone. Gauri Gupta, a disability advocate from India, explains how some period products are outright inaccessible due to factors such as limited mobility. She also highlights how inaccessible infrastructure such as washrooms without basic facilities and a lack of inclusion in period education are both manifestations of ableism that structurally excludes menstruators with disabilities. This can look like a lack of inclusion within the language that we communicated when we are talking about menstruators. Again, bringing in the aspect of how our media tends to promote certain ideas of autonomy. When we are menstruating, we have this idea of, okay, we got to, I don't know, invest in some amount of self-care and just try to work through it, try to continue to work through it. And that language kind of, I don't know where I was going with that. You know how all these ads just have this idea that, okay, ideal that, okay, you go and do work while you're menstruating, and the more amount of work you do is because you are wearing these super comfortable pads or whatever. And all of that is language that is inaccessible. All of that is language that perpetuates ableism and capitalism. And another facet of language is that often when SRHR education is being made available to communities, there is often a lack of sign language interpreter or sign language interpretation. Heck, there's even a lack of translation into local languages, which again makes all of that more inaccessible, and that education does not reach the end user. And that's where positive media representation comes in, because we can't always have SRHR educators
going everywhere all at once. Sometimes the idea of disseminating media or mass media is a lot more effective when it comes to communicating with people. That's the reason why we need to have better positive representation. You may have also noticed that I use menstruators and menstrual products as part of my language, part of my dictionary. I'll leave resources below for you to understand why more in depth. And in general, media's role is just pretty large, like absurdly large in the menstrual movement, and we need to realize that. Padman, a fairly well-known work of menstrual media, movie, whatever, in India, is not without its criticism, but it did sort of help destigmatization in one of the biggest, most impactful mass media industries in India, which is Bollywood. And the reach of a Bollywood movie is crazy if you're thinking about it from a social perspective, from a social worker's perspective, from an NGO's perspective. That kind of reach has so much impact, and at least we can give it that Padman did help sort of destigmatize the issue. However, the work is imperfect, not nearly radical, not nearly intersectional enough, and perhaps overly sensationalized. I'll leave a couple of reviews below which explains where its faults are, where its flaws are, where it actually did well, and how we can use that kind of framework for future positive period representation. Other forms of media include books. The most decent, sensitive, and largely effective, if not intersectional, but a work of popular literature anyhow, featuring menstrual representation, when the work in itself isn't particularly about menstruation or adolescence, like for example all those guides to adolescents or whatever. It's not that. It's not featuring menstruation as a central plot either. The central plot is actually sci-fi. This one book that I have managed to find is actually written by a cis man, my freaking Uncle Rick. Rick Ryden finally did a good job by getting sensitivity readers on board for Daughter of the Deep. And on a side note, the book is nice, a rating of about 3.5. I was kind of hoping that the island in the book would be a little more like Lesbos, but it wasn't. And the book also kind of lacked Rick Ryden's classic quintessential humor. So that was a little disappointing, but the book was okay all around, and was pretty interesting and a good, decent middle grade book, I would say. Anyways, and it did a really good job of normalizing periods and cramps without making the representation seem awkward or forced. Like that was really good rep. I'm really impressed. Anyways, I recently also talked about the very interesting role of period motifs in the short story The Poisonous Hibiscus from the Best Bangladeshi Short Stories collection. Not like positive period rap or anything, but very literary fiction-esque reflection on the human condition. Would recommend if you're into that sort of thing. Some of my favorite menstrual art is considered to be radical and often categorized as art with a shock function. For instance, Casting Off My Womb by Casey Jenkins, where the artist knitted a long act yarn thing over a course of 28 days by inserting a wad of yarn into her vagina every day, which resulted in a largely white cloth which became bloody during a period of time and then resumed to its whiteness. And that was so cool, but it received a lot of hate when when her exhibition artwork entered the public space through a YouTube video posted by an Australian news agency of the artwork, and it received a lot of online social media hate.
But it just goes to show how when menstrual art or period art moves into the public space, and public space and out in the open, it gets censored, receives a lot of hate, etc., etc., which means that menstrual art is largely kept and largely kept back only into a particular section of the art world, which can be elitist at times. It does not allow for folks in general to create menstrual art that is just as public, just as expressive, just as bold and radical. Yeah, I don't like the word bold actually. I prefer the word radical. That is not as radical. Right. However, menstrual art's radicality holds a right to expression that all menstruators should be able to embody. And democratizing this menstrual art, media and writing to facilitate expression of diverse experiences of all menstruators can be done by creating and facilitating safe spaces. And fun fact, I am working on a project right now around this, so go check it out, go check it out. It's really exciting. Anyways, moving on. Another critical work of art is Amanda Atkinson's 306 pounds, which is essentially a pile of coins. Like the artwork is just a pile of coins, but it's worth the cost of period products in a year, which kind of highlighted the issue of period poverty and made it more tangible, more realistic, and brought that to attention. Unfortunately, all the works, artworks, media works, whatever, weren't exactly intersectional beyond conventional explorations of cis girls and women's experiences, and to a certain extent it did touch upon rural and the experiences of people facing socioeconomic discrimination. However, there needs to be more intersectional media representation. There was a prominent Baymax, the show scene, where gender diversity was finally shown, and it took the internet by storm, and it was freaking brilliant. I just love Big Hero 6 so much. Like that childhood, just a perfect kids media, anyways. And my personal favorite exhibited work of art is probably all of the artwork by B. Hughes, who creates such introspective work, and their study of intersections with gender identity, with menstruation as a sociological phenomenon, as a biological phenomenon, is just really interesting and really inspiring as personally as an artist. And their work with materials and it's just really cool. And I will be elaborating about their work in the final class. Photography's role also lays bare the realities of menstruation, and without like going around it or whatever, it just shows you exactly what menstruation is. And it's a frequent for this reason in menstrual artivism. From Ruby Kaur's battle with Instagram to the even more impactful work by the artist Cass Clemmer through Tony the Tampon, where their photograph, their, I believe, coloring book, and accompanying poem really did a lot to degender public discourse on menstruation in the larger space. Anyways, even though all of these do exist, we need more art in media from an intersectional lens. And during the research for this video, I also discovered this really cool book written last year that I unfortunately was not able to source and actually read at the time of the making of this video. But it's called Period Matters, Menstruation in South Asia, and is edited by Farah Ahmad. It seems really cool, really interesting, and I can't wait to actually finally read it. And just like that, we just gotta be able to show kids and adults alike the intersectionalities of menstruation across the spectrum of experiences. And South Asian media, both niche and mass, better step up. An anticlimactic ending to a wonderfully exploratory essay. Let's unearth my IGCSE bio notes to actually understand the science behind menstruation. Or not. I'm sure there are a good dozen of videos on the internet explaining why we do the period thing. So, my point being, we have a bunch of hormones that fluctuate, and then our ovaries and our pituitary gland in the brain do stuff, release hormones at odd times, and then that thing happens, and then our ovaries decide to release an egg, and the follicles get them, and then the egg moves through our uterus, and then it moves out because no sperm came to meet it. So, and then our uterus essentially collapses. Not collapses, that's medically inaccurate, but shreds the inner linings of itself to produce menses, which is the blood that comes out. Right. I hope that did not put you off way too much bio. That went over my head too. Don't worry. Anyways, I'm glad you're still here. And there are also a lot of other biological complexities that come into play when we're talking about the whole menstrual process. PCOS and PCOD being a common one. Stuff happens which affects other stuff. You can search it up. But then there's also amenorrhea, dysmenorrhea, both of which are again other stuff. Many of these illnesses, disorders, etc. are diagnosed late or often go undiagnosed altogether because of a lack of accessibility to safe and affirming menstrual health care, or due to the stigma that affects these issues, making menstruators rendering menstruators hesitant to approach these services, which leads to the further suffering of the menstruator, for the menstruator. In terms of menstrual hygiene, we all know the poor hygiene can also lead to various diseases, but one story puts things into perspective. This story was recently shared with me by a volunteer of Samaj Bandh, which is a India-based non-profit that works for menstrual hygiene in rural and tribal areas, often regions that are secluded or isolated. And for context, in the rural regions of Maharashtra particularly, and in many South Asian regions actually, it is common practice to send menstruating folks to secluded huts, also known as kurma ghar, which are basically these structures that are sometimes they're just 4 walls with attached roof, and they are in very secluded, often dangerous spots where there aren't even any basic facilities to live, to survive. The structure is, as I said, not homely at all, and menstruators are expected to stay there for extended periods of time, for their entire period. In different traditions, the first time a menstruator gets their period, they have to stay there for like 2 weeks sometimes, and those places are unlivable, and there are no washrooms, so there's just no reason for sending the menstruator there. It's not like that place is more comfortable or more hygienic or more safe in any form. And so this volunteer who I met narrated the story to me of a woman who had been sent to one of these kurma ghars, and because of the unsanitary conditions of that place, the sanitary pads that she had stored over there were infected by a lizard that managed to get into the packet, and she ended up wearing those infected pads unknowingly, and that led to her dying, and she passed away because of the illnesses that an infection got her. And I think why I'm sharing this story here is because it puts things into perspective, and I think death pushes us to take collective action, but that should not be the case. There's this obsession with people, with humans, I don't know, with society, where we try to tackle issues after we have faced them, where we try to cure issues or cure the symptoms of issues without understanding where it's coming from, without understanding the cause, without understanding the root. And these measures don't help. We need more preventive measures to actually avoid disaster, to avoid deaths, and we cannot continue to let victims' deaths become statistics, numbers, and horror stories for us to work on later. We need to avoid them in the first place. And these preventive measures just don't happen, and we tend to lose our humanity in the process of trying to avoid the implications on fellow people. We tend to dehumanize the victims and just focus on the quantifiable, focus on trying to mathematically, or I don't know, fix the problem with a solution that is not viable for the long run, and it's just a temporary solution. And that just puts things into perspective, and we really need to take action at the root, abolish systems that are causing harm to the very people who are part of the systems, who are part of the communities. This tradition of the kurma ghar is not something that most menstruators actually want. It's just enforced upon them by this century-old or the local governance systems, and it harms people, it kills people. We can't continue to let it happen. But menstrual activists have been working on this issue for so long, and listening to the volunteer who was speaking to me, it's really hard to get people to change their vision around, their understanding, perception around menstruation. I mean, even in an urban context, we are so hesitant to talk about menstruation. We are so hesitant to understand the varied issues surrounding menstruation. I can't imagine how much worse it is in regions which are secluded from the world, in regions where there's no basic facilities. And I think that's the kind of issue that makes this healthcare, or makes this a public health issue, that makes this a biological issue, that makes this an issue about access to healthcare. And in rural regions, this practice of the kurma ghar affects the menstruators not just physically, not just in terms of their health, in terms of their physical health, but in terms of their psychological health as well. It adds this notion that you can't engage in life if you are menstruating, that you are secluded, that you are cast away for that period, which sucks. And it just perpetuates that notion that you are not a part of anything, that you are supposed to be isolated during that period. And in just both contexts, urban, rural, etc., the context, the nexus of mental health with menstrual health faces a dual sort of stigma, wherein both the stigmas overlap and make things worse, doubly worse, that is. And for instance, I'll be talking about two aspects of mental health, of the intersection of mental health and menstrual health, but there are a lot of other ways that menstrual health can affect one's mental health and the way that mental health can affect one's menstrual health. Given that menstrual health is invariably linked to nutrition as well as mental health, the ways in which eating disorders can affect menstruation are actually quite important to understand and important to research more about, and important to understand specifically for medical professionals, because they do not tend to understand that, and they can guide menstruators wrongly. And when this failure on the part of the medical institution or practitioners or healthcare providers to understand the inclusivity and the intersectional approach of menstruation, again makes those healthcare systems less accessible and less affirming, less safe for menstruators to approach. PMDD is another lesser known issue, that's premenstrual dysphoric disorder, with about 1 in 20 menstruators going through it. And I have a whole comic explaining why it is different from regular PMS, but it's worse basically, but it's a lot more complex than just that basic understanding. So I would recommend you read that comic or whatever resources I have put there. And when it comes to PMS itself, again would highly recommend Kristen Leo's video to understand how to understand PMS from the perspective of the menstruator rather than from a medicalized perspective, and elaborating on what I talked about earlier, because I think it's important to highlight those in case someone is going through that. Dysmenorrhea is when, to put it simply, again I'm explaining these things in very simple terms, please go and do your research from actual good sources, from sources of people who have actually studied this and who have actual medical expertise in this. But dysmenorrhea is basically when your cramps are really severe, and menorrhea is when you skip your periods for I think longer than 3 months, where you don't have your period for an extended period of time. It can be primary or secondary, that's different. And then yeah, I think those are the main issues that I know about, but there are a lot of other facets where menstruation can affect one's body and mind and everything that connects it. It's complicated, but an important understanding, right? In general, again, menstruators can face a whole myriad of health issues, but I'm no medical professional, so I'm not going to go into the medical details. But because I'm an artist, we're going to understand one of my favorite menstrual artists' research paper on this topic. It's so cool. It's B. Yug's Challenging Menstrual Norms in Online Medical Advice, Deconstructing Stigma Through Entangled Art Practice. And that title, that research paper title is so good, it gets me, oh my god, that's so interesting. Anyways, just research paper titles sometimes be like so interesting. Anyways, where in this research paper they essentially explored the stereotyping of menstruation in its relation to sex and reproduction, which is an incredibly cis heteronormative perception of a biological process. It also has other functions that are not purely for sex and reproduction, like bodily regulation or and therefore psychological regulation. And even in this video I talk about SRHR education, because it is what menstrual health and menstruation is generally linked to. But I think it might be useful to separate the ideas of reproductive justice and reproductive rights from menstrual justice and menstrual rights, not necessarily as completely separate concepts, but if not entirely to that extent, but at least to the extent that they are related, that those two concepts are related, but they can't be synonymous, and that's what we need to understand. BU's art practice, as discussed earlier, I think revolves around the idea of breaking down our structural framework when we approach something as fluid as I can't remember the word today, but as much as it has a tendency to get affected by things, and something that's as complex as menstruation. And in order to achieve this novel approach of inclusivity, radical justice, and true equity, we have to first understand menstruation through the lenses of intersectional, eco-anarcha, socialist, Ambedkarite, feminist approach. Did I get everything? Oh yeah, I did. So all of those different approaches, but we need to get them together. Radical, it's fun. Anyways, it's really interesting. Not fun in terms of actual work, but like, it's a utopia that that thinking about is great. Anyways, essentially, to achieve that utopia, we've needed a lot of work on smash hegemonies, aka the Brahmanical, cis heteronormative, ableist, capitalist, environmentally destructive patriarchy. But I'm just throwing around a bunch of words, that's what it feels like right now, but it sounded a lot better when I was typing, and it sounded a lot more dramatic and a lot more impactful, but now it's just like throwing words, which is also fun. Worth throwing, I mean. Anyways, I try to be as comprehensive as possible and read up and researched a lot. I have been scripting this video for like 3 months, and I've been working in this space for over a year now. I myself struggle with my menstrual health. It's not fun. It is fun. Not fun. Not fun. Not fun. Anyways, but naturally, I'm bound to have missed including some aspect or intersection of perspective, because there are a lot of them. This issue is really, really broad, and it's hard to get everything together in a 1-hour video essay. But that was not the point. The point was to kind of inspire you to broaden your horizons and perspectives when it comes to menstruation. Everything that I talked about is not everything. Every single menstruator's experience is different, and that's obviously like, what, 3 billion perspectives. So yeah, I couldn't obviously cover that in this video. Anyways, and that's just 3 billion people who are alive. I'm not even talking about like the historic people or the future people who will be menstruating. There are just a bunch of perspectives to consider, and an hour is way too less for that. Anyways, given that I haven't myself experienced most of the things I've discussed in today's video, and obviously won't experience everything when it comes to the menstrual experience, because that's so vast again, the lens that I view these issues through is probably perhaps biased. Perhaps, not perhaps actually, it's almost definitely biased by my own privileges, by my own understanding of the world, by my own worldview, and I can only be an imperfect advocate at best. I would encourage everyone to read the resources in the description if you have the time and privilege to self-educate, which is really important. Again, if you have the time and privilege, I would highly encourage you to. And thank you so much for staying awake through today's classes. Should I become a teacher? Should I become an educator? That's a question that you can answer in the comment section. Was I a good teacher? I have a feeling I wasn't, but anyways, and whoops, that's the bell. See y'all next time, folks.